All right. Good morning, everyone. It's Andrew with Defiant Tactical. Um, I've got a little chip on my shoulder and just need to get some information out here. I had a conversation with someone close to me yesterday about the use of force. We actually watched a use of force video in which a police officer had been called to a domestic situation. And they pulled up, and there was a bunch of people milling about in the front yard. I think the dispatcher had provided some information that there was someone trying to stab people in the home, and he pulls up, and as soon as he gets there, a couple of people kind of tumble out of the yard and are tussling and fighting, right? And so this one girl gets up and goes running after this other girl, and she has a knife in her hand. And so as she goes to stab this other girl, the police officer, of course, drew and fired his weapon, killing the girl, which of course is sad. It's unfortunate that that kind of thing has to happen, but it happened and it was necessary. And so the person that was watching it with me, made the comment, that, well, he should have just been able to shoot to wound this person, right? Should have just shot her in the leg or something rather than shooting her in the chest. In the back is what it really was. And so I want to talk about that for a second. So the idea of shooting to wound and why we do not do that and why it is a horrible idea. I ended up watching a couple of other YouTube videos. There are a few out there that are really good. John from Active Self-Protection always has a really good, direct, and not like asshole-ish approach to answering questions like this. So he has a good video you should go check out on the topic. But I just would like to talk a little bit about it. So I set up some notes over here, so I'm going to try and walk through these. So I guess let me start off by saying that whenever I hear someone say something, if you're a person who thinks this, okay, I want you to understand that when I or someone else who has actually been through firearms training or who conducts firearms training on a regular basis, hear you say something like that, okay, it makes very evident to us frankly, that you lack education, right? And I mean this in a respectful and not at all derogatory way, but that you're ignorant, okay? It tells me that you have probably never been to a use of force class. It tells me you've probably never received formal firearms training. You've probably never received any instruction on use of force best practices, legal frameworks, physiological effects and means of stopping someone using a firearm. You probably have no education on any of that stuff. And you're speaking from a position of ignorance. And I would suspect that if you just had that education, you probably would have a different opinion. I'm going to do a little bit of educating on that here today. So if you hold that opinion, I would urge you to seek proper training. Go and get educated from competent instructors. And I'll kind of hammer on that repeatedly here, because it's not an educated opinion to have. And it's not just not a good opinion to have. It's like totally wrong. Okay? So when it comes to self-defense and the use of force, okay, just like with any other industry or discipline, there are a series of best practices that have evolved that guide the way that we should behave and the things that we should do, okay? One of those best practices when it comes to self-defense is that in self-defense, we should take aim at what is called the center of mass, or typically the largest mass that we have available to us, okay? And typically, that is the center of mass. That would be the sort of the chest area, and I'll get some more into that later. And like I said, I use that term best practice deliberately, okay? We have learned collectively, we as society and as a community of shooters and, both law enforcement and military and private sector have learned through both academic study and also sometimes decades or even centuries of experience, right? We've learned about human behavior and physiology and anatomy and human performance. And we've also learned through experience and lessons paid for by blood, right? For people who have tried and done other things that don't work, what works. in a self-defense deadly force situation, right? The practices that are in place, the best practices and policies that are in place that are taught by the majority of self-defense trainers weren't just pulled out of thin air. Okay, these things evolved and developed over time as we learned more about what actually works in these kinds of situations. Okay, and so I'm going to refer to best practices repeatedly here. But keep in mind that we're not just pulling this stuff out of thin air, okay? And so we should adhere to best practices when we're picking out tactics to use for personal defense. Now, shooting to wound is a tactic, okay? It's a bad tactic, but it's a tactic. And when we talk about the tactics we should use in personal defense, different tactics should be used at different times. All right. There are some situations where we may need one tactic, and other situations where we may need others. The point is that the situation in which we find ourselves is what drives the tactic we should use. Okay. So let's evaluate a little bit the situation that warrants shooting in the first place. Okay, and then we can talk about shooting to wound. So, morally and legally, there's really only ever one situation where deadly force should be used. Okay? And that is to stop an imminent deadly threat to you or someone else in your presence. And that's it, right? We don't use deadly force in any other circumstance. All right? It's only to stop an imminent deadly threat to you or someone else. And what that means is that if we have to draw a firearm, it's due to an urgent threat, all right? When I said imminent, that means urgent and present. It is happening right now. And if you don't do something about it right now, your life will end, or that of someone else that you care about is going to end. So we have to act. That's the situation we're in, right? So what is our goal? Our purpose, whatever we do in that situation, in this case, we're talking about drawing a firearm and shooting. Our purpose is to stop the threat as quickly as possible. Okay, a lot of trainers make a big deal about this distinguishing between trying to kill and stop, and sometimes it's just semantics. But it is true in that what we want at that moment is to just stop the threatening behavior. All right, we just want them to stop trying to stab that girl with a knife. We just want them to stop trying to kill us. We want them to stop trying to beat in my son's head with a bat, right? That's what I want. That's all I want. So, what are the best practices? What does industry standard best practices indicate will achieve that goal? Well, we refer to these things, the means to achieve a stop. That's what we do. Is we refer to those things that will stop a person as stops, right? Those are the ways in which a human body is stopped from being able to continue to function as a threat. Okay? So I want to go over those real quick, and I think that after we've done that, we can spin back around to the question of shooting to wound. So there are kind of three different categories of stops that we can achieve on a threat. Okay? And the first is a psychological stop. Okay, and what that means is that the person, for whatever reason, chose to stop threatening. Okay? Now, that's great if it happens. The problem with it is that you don't have any control over it. Okay? So, you don't get to choose if the person decides to stop. Okay? Now, you may hope that a reasonable person would stop, but you don't have any control over it. So while a reasonable person perhaps would stop at the sight of a gun, or hearing a slide rack or a shotgun rack, right? Maybe a reasonable person might stop when they hear those things. Not everyone will, all right? The guy who's hopped up on drugs might not stop, okay? The person who's experiencing a psychotic break might not stop, okay? There's no guarantee, even a grazing wound, right? If you have shot someone, for example, you've shot to wound them, all right, and you've grazed them, or it's a through and through shot that you managed to pull off into the their shoulder or their arm or something, there's no guarantee that someone in a psychotic break or on drugs or that's just absolutely determined to do what they're doing, like an ideological fanatic, right? You have no guarantee that that's going to stop. Just the other day, I watched a video of terrorists who stormed some government building it was in an African nation. And there was a guy who got shot. I mean, he got shot good by a guard, okay? And he was bleeding out of his artery under his arm. You could see he somehow got hit up under his armpit, and every time he opened his arm like this, blood splurted out. Right? He kept going, okay, for minutes. He pursued the guards still. He shot into rooms. He tossed grenades. So there's no guarantee that someone is going to stop, or even someone who's just inoculated, like used to violence, right? Like someone who's been in and out of prison and they're used to firearms, used to being threatened, used to threatening other people, or that questions your commitment. You're not actually going to use that kind of thing. Those people may not be fazed by any of those things, whether it's the sight of a gun or hearing the gun rack or a warning shot or being grazed by a firearm. And so that is why, as a best practice, we do not rely on psychological stops, okay? And that's why, that is one reason that we discourage things like brandishing a firearm, right? We don't draw the firearm and then threaten someone with it. That's why we discourage, like Joe Biden suggested, just racking the shotgun and firing one off into the air. We don't do that, okay? Because the stop is not guaranteed, okay? So we don't rely on those things. All right, so that's the psychological stop. Let's talk about the next category, which is cardiovascular stops, okay? So a cardiovascular stop occurs when you cause damage to the person's cardiovascular system. We're talking about the heart, their arteries, their lungs, the ability for the body to pump blood around, right? So when you perforate those parts of the body, okay, and prevent them from being able to get oxygen in and circulate it around the body, then you're going to cause a stop, all right? They're going to lose consciousness eventually and cease to be a threat to you, okay? Now, the problem with cardiovascular stops is that they're not instant, okay? They're kind of guaranteed, right? Like, so you put a hole through someone's heart, they're going to stop, but it's not guaranteed and it's not immediate. Just like the video I just talked about, that guard got a cardiovascular stop on that threat. He perforated his artery somewhere under his arm, and he was spurting blood, but he didn't cease to be a threat immediately. And in fact, he continued to be a deadly threat for long enough to shoot into rooms, continue to pursue those guards, and throw grenades down the hall. So we can't rely necessarily on a cardiovascular stop to cause an immediate stop, but it will cause a stop, okay? The best practice is that's a reasonable thing to pursue, right? In an imminent threat, a cardiovascular stop is something to try and go for. And the third is a central nervous system stop, a CNS stop. So a CNS stop occurs when we disrupt the person's central nervous system, okay? We basically disconnect the brain from the body, all right? And these kinds of stoppages are ideal. The reason I say that they're ideal is because they're instant. If you disconnect the brain from the body, the threat stops right then and there, okay? They can't control themselves, obviously, because you have severed their spinal cord or perforated their brain. They can't continue to be a threat. And so those are ideal in that they are instant, okay? Problem with those is that they tend to be hard because the targets are not large, okay? The targets, the parts of the body that will affect the CNS are not large. So, all right, so now that we've talked about the ways that we stop a person, we stop a threat, let's kind of spin back around to talk about. Actually, before I spin back around to the question of shooting to wound, I want to go from the stops, the kinds of stops, to where we shoot a person to achieve them. Okay. So again, experience and best practices dictate that there are two parts of the body, typically, that we aim for, that we target, that we train to shoot in order to achieve a cardio or CNS stop. The first is the thoracic cavity. All right? The thoracic cavity extends more or less from the collarbone here over to the sides of the chest and down to the bottom of the rib cage. Okay? This is the thoracic cavity, the upper thoracic cavity, I guess. And inside of this part of the human body, there are a ton of vitals that pertain to and can achieve cardio and CNS stops. You've got the heart. It's over here, just kidding. So you got the heart, you've got your lungs, you've got the liver, and you've got a spinal cord there. Okay? So perforating any of those things is most of those things is going to cause cardiovascular trauma and will begin the process of bleeding out, of exsanguination, right? That's the process of losing blood so that you lose consciousness and cease to be a threat. Okay? Now you have a very small spinal cord here that from a threats facing you has got a sternum that's in between you and the spinal cord in the back. Nevertheless, you do have a chance of hitting the spinal cord, which also would potentially give you a CNS stop. So the thoracic cavity is a very good, by best practice, is a good place to aim for reactive defensive shooting. Additionally, it's large. Okay, as the human body goes, the thoracic cavity is kind of as big as you got. Okay, and so that is a really good target for defensive shooting. Now, the other part of the body that we typically aim at, is the cranioocular cavity. The cranioocular cavity extends from the top of your eyebrows over to the side of your head here, to your ears basically, and down to the bottom of your nose. It's about a 3x5 index card, depending on how big your head is. Mine's probably a little bit bigger. So that part of the head, okay, if you shoot a target, if you shoot a threat through that part of their head, you will damage the brain such that it typically also causes an immediate stoppage. Okay, I guess the internal, if I'm remembering right from some of my classes, which it's been a while, the core survival fight or flight parts of the brain are sort of in the lower inside part of the brain, right? The top parts and the back parts, that's sort of our more advanced reasoning and stuff. The lights out is going to be through here, okay, to the lower inside part of the brain. And so that is a valid place to shoot a threat to get lights out, right? But the problem is that that's a 3x5 index card that you're trying to shoot under stress, potentially in a moving target, potentially in an environment where there's people and places you don't want to shoot, right? So it's hard. That is not an easy place to aim. And so it's typically reserved for special situations where perhaps there's a failure to stop, right? We've shot someone a couple times in the chest. They're still threatening us, and we can't get them to stop. I don't have another choice. They're up on drugs. They're having a psychotic break, whatever, and I just need to put the lights out. Or maybe you have a degree of skill, and the threat is so close to you that you can shoot that, for the face, and that's fine too. Pardon. The point is that it's a more difficult shot. Okay. Now that we've established those types of stops and what best practices tell us where we should shoot the human body to achieve those stops, let's spin back around to this thought of shooting to wound. How does that do in that light for pursuing our objective? Shooting to wound, it does not give us very good results at all. Okay, so shooting to wound someone, I'm going to go out on a limb and say shooting to wound means shooting an appendage, a leg or an arm, a hand or a foot. Will that give us a psychological stop? Maybe. Perhaps less likely than if, I don't know. There's a possibility that it'll give us a psychological stop. Certainly no better chance of a psychological stop than shooting them in the chest or somewhere else. Okay. Will shooting someone in the arm or leg give us a cardiovascular stop? Probably not. Now, it's possible that you shoot someone in the leg and you sever the femoral artery, in which case you're no better off than having shot them in the chest in the first place. So maybe, but not super likely. Will it give us a CNS stop? And the answer to that is no. We're not going to get a central nervous system stop by shooting someone in an appendage. Okay, so, and on top of that, it's hard. Okay, the leg, the foot, the arm, the hands, these are not large parts of the body, right? I mean, this is maybe, I wish my arms were bigger, but maybe 4 or 5 inches across. My thigh is maybe, I don't know, 6 to 8 inches across. And these are parts that move a lot, right? On human beings, the arms are rare, and the legs are, especially someone who's being a threat to you, is rarely, like, they're rarely just static. They're moving, they're flailing, they're maybe trying to hit you with something. Perhaps they have a knife. Maybe they've got a gun, right? And if I've got a gun, my arms are like this. It's not even like you have a full side broadside to my arm to take a shot at. I'm shooting you like this, right? So what are you going to try and do, right? Now you've got something literally the size of my fist to aim at, maybe a little bit wider, okay? That's it's not a practical approach, okay? It's hard and it's ineffective. So, don't do it. We, as a best practice, as taught by firearms trainers across the globe, as taught by every police academy in the United States, as taught by any self-defense instructor that has any validity whatsoever, we aim for center of mass in order to cause a stop as quickly as possible, that the threat has no control over, that we have control over, and that's going to be a CNS or a cardiovascular stop. Now, this is really easy to test, by the way, the practicality of doing this. Go get an airsoft gun and go get a buddy and have them run around. Aim for their leg. Shoot in the leg. See if you can do it. Just have them stand steady. All right? Go to the range with a real firearm and get something, I don't know, 4 or 6 inches wide and stand it up at 10 yards and try to shoot it static. Now, imagine doing that while it's moving. Now, imagine doing that while it's moving and there's other things you don't necessarily want to hit. Now, imagine doing that and that thing is moving at you with a knife or a bat or shooting back at you. It's not just flippantly, just wound them. It's not flippant like that. All right. I think that point's made. Let me pivot to another point. I want to touch on the legal and kind of moral framework that goes behind the thought of using deadly force in general. Okay? Does the law, I'm going to ask a question and I'm going to answer it. Okay? Does the law look at shooting someone in the leg differently than shooting them in the chest with a firearm? Does the law see shooting someone in the leg differently than shooting them in the chest? No, it does not. If you are using force that is likely to cause death or serious bodily injury, okay, that is force that is likely to kill the person or cause them permanent serious injury, okay, and shooting a person anywhere on their body solidly falls into that category, okay, then you're using deadly force, and it doesn't matter where you're shooting the person. Whether you're shooting them in the finger or in the face, it's deadly force, according to the law. And so you're on the hook for using deadly force no matter where you shoot the person. Whether you say you were shooting to wound or you say you were shooting them in the chest. Now, I don't want that to be misinterpreted, okay? I'm not trying to say that since all deadly force is the same, you might as go for as much as you can. Like, that's not my point. What I'm saying is that if you wouldn't be justified legally and honestly morally, if you wouldn't be justified in shooting a person in the chest or the face, then you aren't justified in shooting them in the leg or the arm. And you shouldn't be shooting to begin with. Okay? Keep in mind the situation we're talking about is a deadly threat that has to be stopped now. Not in a little bit, now. If you have time to shoot to wound the person rather than using your best practice, what that tells me is that the threat is not imminent. And if the threat is not imminent, deadly force is not morally or legally justified to begin with, and the firearm shouldn't be at play. Okay? And that's all I have to say about that. The use of deadly force is not a joke, right? I mean, it's fun to train these things, and I find it enjoyable to maintain skills and knowledge on these topics. But the use of deadly force is serious business, right? We're talking about maintaining skills that will take another person's life to preserve our own. And as a person that carries, if you carry, it is your responsibility to maintain knowledge and to maintain the skills to be able to do the job if fate taps you on the shoulder and it's your turn to go. Okay, whether that's to preserve your life or that of your family or that of someone else because you happen to be placed in an active shooter situation. Okay, it is your responsibility to, I'll borrow from James Yeager, right? It's your responsibility to be ready for the fight. All right, it's your responsibility to be educated on these things. And if you are running around with ideas like shooting to wound, okay, that's viable, then you need to go get yourself educated. You need to go, and again, I'll say it for like the third or fourth time in this video, you need to go to a valid, experienced, credentialed firearms instructor, and you need to get yourself taught, because that is not a valid approach. All right? I think that's all I've got to say on that. I've rambled for almost a half an hour. Anyone who watches this whole video, comment below and tell me how much you hate how long my videos are. All right, this is Andrew with Defiant Tactical. I appreciate you guys hanging out with me for a minute and listening to me ramble. We'll catch you on another one.